So how is the Canadian millennial generation doing? Some people say they can be obsessed with selfies, technology, and not a lot of interest in spiritual issues. Joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Joel Thiessen, professor of sociology at Ambrose University in Calgary and co-author of The Millennial Mosaic with Moneta Bailey and Lethbridge's own Reg Bibby. Dr. Thiessen, welcome to BCN.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Can you give me a brief snapshot on what the book really touches on?
Yeah. Who are millennials? How do they view the world? What are their beliefs and practices? And how are they similar or different from young people of previous generations? That's what we tackle in this book.
So how did you go about doing some of the research on this?
Yeah, well, we lean on Reg Bibby's research back to the early 80s, who's been tracking young people. And so this book captures work of his with a nationally representative survey sample in 2015 and 2016 to give us an up-to-date read on Canada's young people compared to young people in previous generations.
Now, one of your findings is quite interesting in that millennials are attending church services more often than their older counterparts, like myself, a Gen Xer, or some of the baby boomers. Did that really surprise you?
It did surprise us. We didn't expect it from some of the other literature and research. And when you dig down, you find out that much of this is driven by immigration and young immigrants who are highly devout, highly religious in a variety of religious contexts that is driving some of that figure up. So did not expect it, and was a surprise.
Now, on the other hand, though millennials attend church more frequently, you say they may pray less than other groups. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, in part you find among their parents or grandparents who will pray more regularly because it's a more customized, socialized narrative that they've embraced growing up. Whereas while young people might attend more often, those who do, there's also a growth of those who don't identify with any religion. And in part, that plays itself out with fewer who are praying relative to their parents or grandparents.
Now, apparently 1 in 3 millennials have little use for organized religion whatsoever. What is it about religion that is a real turnoff for millennials?
Yeah, 2 key things stand out to us. One is that fewer young people today are actually raised within a religious tradition. So it's not that they're leaving a religion, they just aren't raised or exposed whatsoever. So that's driving some of those numbers. And then, as you note, some are leaving religion. It's scandals and hypocrisies that they see within religious groups. They grow disinterested, they get involved in other things. Science, evidence versus faith, these kinds of things have become problematic. So there's different reasons and explanations for why some leave, but it's not the only reason for the growth of those who say they're not interested in organized religion.
Now, Dr. Thiessen, you also asked millennials to respond to a couple of statements. One is, I prefer to live life without church or congregation, to which 47% agreed. And the other was, I'd be open to greater involvement if I found it to be worthwhile, to which 42% agreed. So what were some of the things that they would view as being worthwhile?
Yeah, we don't ask directly or talk about it in this book so much on that question, but in some of our other research we do, and we capture ideas of, if I was loved and cared for in a community, then I'd be more likely to attend. If the ministries of a local church were actually engaging the needs of my family, if I could find a place where the preaching was relevant and the music was strong and engaging, these kinds of things. And yet at the same time, we do engage a bit of a debate of, while they might say on a survey they would entertain greater involvement, this doesn't necessarily mean that they will pursue greater involvement. And so we unpack how likely or unlikely it is that young people will in fact pursue greater involvement down the road. And you just don't know until you see as they become older and see what happens there.
In your research, what have you found were some of the biggest differences between millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers?
They certainly stand out among millennials in terms of how open and tolerant and diverse they claim or seem to be on a range of issues, whether it's sexuality, gender, the environment, immigration, things where people are different than themselves. They seem to be far more open, tolerant, and accepting towards people who are different. And this is part of that pluralistic social context that they've been raised within that is quite different than how their parents or grandparents would have been raised. And technology certainly factors into that. Having a broader awareness of different perspectives and viewpoints around the world would be one of the key differences we noted.
Do you think maybe some of the older generation has more of a narrow focus as well, as opposed to millennials?
It certainly could be that. And as sociologists, we don't attach a normative assessment of whether that's a good or bad thing, but certainly there is a narrower lens for viewing the world, because this, in fact, is the way in which they were raised by their own parents, by the education system, the political structure. And millennials today, frankly, just have a very different social world that they've been raised within, to embrace people who are different than themselves and to have a broader orientation towards different groups in that way.
Now, some of your research found that pervasive individualism is a common trait of millennials. Does this mean they really prefer to focus more on themselves?
Not necessarily. In fact, we might even argue that parents and grandparents are also highly individualistic in some ways. It has more to do with the ways in which that individualism plays itself out. So, for example, when you're picking a school or a potential marital partner and so forth, individualism means that you rely upon your own preferences for making those decisions rather than deferring to other authorities, what your parents might think, what your religious organization might tell you. And in this way, millennials tend to be highly individualistic in how they make those choices and how they make the decisions, that I am the ultimate authority and autonomy over those decisions.
To what degree has technology, the internet, and even social media influenced millennials in making choices on religious and spiritual options?
Yeah, this is an understudied area within the field, and our own data suggests that fewer than 10% of millennials are going online to, say, watch religious services or to perform various spiritual practices. So it doesn't seem to be particularly pervasive, and yet we do anticipate as we move forward that you'll find different ways in which young people are interacting with technology and social media that would broaden their perspective. And I would say this is a major area of research to give more attention to, certainly engaging more than their parents or grandparents, but it's not the lead influencer over how they're making their religious or spiritual decisions thus far.
It's interesting to note that the perception of who God is has changed over the generations. When asked the question, does God or higher power care about you personally, only 53% of millennials agreed, compared to 59% of Gen Xers like myself and 63% of baby boomers like my mother.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting finding because our beliefs and practices are informed by the social context that we find ourselves in. And part of the lower rates that we find here is that some millennials are raised in non-religious homes for all intents and purposes. So they aren't growing up to adopt a particular view towards God or the supernatural that we might find among baby boomers and Gen Xers who are more inclined to view God in the ways that you've just described.
Now, there were some other interesting findings as well, Dr. Thiessen. More millennials believe in life after death and more believe in the existence of hell than Gen Xers and boomers. Any idea why that is?
Yeah, this is definitely a curious one. It stood out to us as we were going through the data. A couple things come to mind. One, the frequency of discussion in pop culture and media, in movies and music and social media that's giving attention to life after death and to hell, that those social influences shape what young people are thinking and ultimately believing there. I would say a second thing that factors in that earlier point I made about immigration and its impact on religion, that we know among young immigrants who are religious, they tend to be far more devout, more conservative in their religious beliefs and practices, and beliefs about life after death and the existence of hell certainly fall in line with more conservative religious orientations on those belief systems.
Yeah, let's talk about different millennials from different cultures. Let's say a Canadian millennial versus maybe someone from the States or someone from Europe or Africa or even Asia. What were some of the big differences and maybe some of the commonalities that you found?
Yeah, there are many commonalities, some of the things that we've spoken of already, but some of the differences do arise based on the experiences of distinct racial groups, for example, in Canada. So we're looking at Indigenous groups, for example, looking at those from Latin America, from Africa, and Southeast Asia, that there are different perspectives and experiences in education systems, in the economic system, in religious contexts, in political settings. And throughout the book, we chart the different ways how those different ethnic groups are making sense of their experiences. And for some of those groups, they are most certainly in marginalized positions and less so for other racialized groups. So it's hard to give an overarching, broad, sweeping response because there are variations based on different racial groups, but differences are certainly there.
Now, you found that millennials do value characteristics like honesty and politeness and concern for others, but I want to flesh this out. You mentioned a little bit on this earlier here. They're more inclined than other generations to accept every kind of social, demographic, and lifestyle variation, and you also believe that pluralism, which you touched on earlier, is a big part of their DNA. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, you think about the education system, what students are taught in the schools about increasingly embracing people who are different than ourselves, and this goes back to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You think about the political structures, how laws have changed across the country in the last 5 to 10 years relative to different historically marginalized groups. Religious groups and organizations are talking about these things. Social media, you see it all over the place. Families are passing these things on. So all of these things that come together create a social environment that millennials take these things for granted. They can't believe how and why someone wouldn't accept someone who's different than themselves on a number of different social and demographic variables.
It's interesting to see that even though millennials have concerns about the future, they're not really despairing. Rather, they have high hopes and expectations when it comes to careers, income, and family.
Yeah, this is a common thing of this stage of life. In fact, one of the things we do in the book is we track young people in previous generations, and then we track the same people as they age into their 40s and 50s and see how they turn out. And you find that young people across time have been very optimistic at this stage of life, perhaps overly optimistic in terms of what will actually happen later on in their life. But it doesn't seem, despite some of the things we see in the media and popular discourse, that young people are very optimistic, despite the challenges they confront, and we explore those, optimistic about their chances in life and school and work and buying a house and these kinds of things later on in life.
I joke with my son many times. I refer to him as an old soul, even though he's only 23 years of age. So it seems like he may connect more with his grandparents, the boomers, than with the Generation Xers. In your study and your research, what kind of commonalities have you found between millennials? Do they actually connect maybe better with their grandparents? Maybe the baby boomers?
Yeah, great question. We don't look specifically about whether they connect across each of those generations. We look with mother and father and extent of their ties there. But we would say there actually are far more things in common than not in common between millennials and older generations. That many of their hopes and dreams in life, some of the fears and concerns they have in the world, that millennials are not as distinct as many might assume them to be. And that actually might be one of the greatest takeaways from the book, that people are people, and the social environment that we grew up in creates a set of contexts and conditions for how we see ourselves and other people. And while we see differences, and we've talked about some of those already, there are far more things in common across those different generations.
Dr. Thiessen, any final thoughts on your research on the millennial generation that you'd like to leave with our viewers?
The one thing I would say that stands out to us is that young people are given many choices around what school I'm going to pick, what career, what person I'm going to marry, and so forth, but very little direction on how to make wise choices. And it can be overwhelming for a millennial to say, I have these 50 choices before me and I don't know what choice to make. And so one of the takeaways we talk about near the end of the book is, what does it look like for parents and teachers and adult influencers to help guide young people in making good decisions, to not just say, here's the choices, make a decision, but how do we help you in that process of making the decision? And we think there's a great opportunity for interaction between millennials and parents and grandparents in and around that theme and topic.
Dr. Joel Thiessen, co-author of The Millennial Mosaic, thanks a lot for joining me today from Calgary.
Thank you, my pleasure.